Well, good evening, everyone. Real quick, I want to talk about Chilling, the awesome horror app that I'm partnered with. Now, in case you haven't heard, every week I have new stories released over on Chilling. There are now over 1,000 stories there, with a bunch of other YouTube narrators and professionals to choose from. Now, on Chilling, you can do things that you'll never be able to do on YouTube. Choose from over 1,000 individual stories, and they're sorted into curated playlists, or you can create your own. On Chilling, we give you so much flexibility to listen the way you want. This includes a Chilling game-changing feature, our own ambient menu. You can change the background sounds of the story at any time to fit your mood. Go from rain to a campfire with the press of a button. It's totally revolutionary, and you need to try it. There have been a number of recent awesome updates to Chilling, such as the ability to download stories for offline listening, and the new social feature. You can now discuss your favorite stories with other users and friends. And we are just getting started. Not only are we adding hours of new content every week, but original video content is also in the works. Chilling is evolving into a must-have for all horror lovers. Now please go start your free trial on Chilling and check out my personal playlist there. Oh, and this month, Chilling's also giving away another PS5 bundle. Just leave a review on Google Play or the App Store, letting us know what you think. Click the link in the description for more details on how to enter. It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. A desperate gold prospector travels to a tropical island to search for gold, and finds more than he expected. Dumakulem Awakens by Taxi Dancer. Part 1. By his mid-20s, Chad Malcolm Van King knew he wasn't cut out for the world of work. Hell, he wasn't cut out for a lot of things. In college, he decided to go for a creative writing degree, at first thinking that he'd use it as a springboard to become a Hollywood screenwriter. He quickly abandoned that idea when it became painfully obvious that Hollywood was only interested in rehashing and repackaging cheap, almost satirical remakes of far better films from the past. The eternal cash grab of the almighty dollar surpassing any desire in Hollywood to actually put out something with good storytelling. Plus, Chad's own writing style lacked any originality, creativity, or inspiration. His writings more often than not reflecting the cheap repackaging of much better written stories. Quitting that endeavor, Chad decided to delve into a music and fine arts degree, subjects which he thought would pique his interest. However, since the music classes rarely focused on discussing the historical impact of today's modern progressive grunge, rap, and hip-hop artists, which he listened to, and since the classes in art didn't allow him to sketch naked hot co-eds as often as he'd liked, Chad quickly became bored with this adventure as well. He was still living at home, much to the chagrin of his stepfather, who was constantly dropping little hints for him that, as he'd just celebrated his 25th birthday only 2 weeks ago, it was probably time for him to leave the nest. His brother, who was 4 years older than him, moved out of the house at 19, did a 4-year stint in the army, got married, and was now running a successful 5-star rated bed and breakfast up in Burlington. His older sister by over a year had married an officer in the Navy and was now living in Virginia Beach, fulfilling her white, Christian, conservative wifely duties of pumping out a couple of little future white supremacists while running her own catering business. Chad was never close to his older siblings, who seemed to take after his more backwards conservative grandparents rather than embracing today's more progressive, cultured reality. Great-grandpa had served as a paratrooper with the 101st Airborne Division during World War II and survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge. His was called the Greatest Generation, and Great-grandpa, having survived the war relatively intact and in one piece, did what everyone of the Greatest Generation did. Great-grandpa came home, married his high school sweetheart, and they had lots and lots of sex. And besides helping to create the baby boomer generation, Great-grandma had 4 daughters and 3 sons. Great-grandpa also started his own logging and milling company in Colchester, not too far from Burlington where Chad grew up. It was hard at first, while with Great-grandpa trying to start up his business and Great-grandma having to take on a part-time job to help pay the bills while still raising the kids. Chad's older brother once wrote to him, while he was serving in Iraq. But eventually, a family logging and milling business boomed. That was what the greatest generation did. They defended the world against Nazi fascism and Japanese imperialism. Then they made America great. That's why I joined after 9/11, to defend everything our family and our nation fought for. Yay, Chad thought. Yay for white people. Grandpa Dan served in Vietnam as an infantry officer. When Grandpa Dan was injured, he returned from the war and was discharged from the army. Since his leg injuries meant he could no longer work in the family's successful logging company, he took his share of the stocks and started a shrimp boat company, starting with just one shrimp boat but eventually expanding the company to 6 boats. By the time Grandpa Dan retired, he was a successful man who could spend the rest of his days traveling the world and vacation to the places where his generation's systemic racism forced the locals to serve drinks to white racists. Chad respected his grandparents and great-grandparents well enough, despite the fact that they were a product of their times, being white, conservative Christian, God-fearing racists and bigots. But that's why he wasn't as close to his older brother or sister, whose insensitivity to the plight of the LGBTQ and minority community could be traced all the way back to his unenlightened grandparents. Still, after Grandpa Dan passed away last year, it was nice to have been gifted an inheritance of $30,000, most of which Chad had spent on parties, women, and blow. The rest of his inheritance Chad wasted on half-heartedly paying back the friends he borrowed money from. Chad mostly identified with his mother, who was the youngest of Grandpa Dan's 4 daughters. Grandma had his mother relatively late in her life, at the age of 51, and Chad's mom ended up being the most liberal and free-spirited of her siblings. Chad's mom eloped to LA with his father, who at the time was a struggling musician in a hair metal band back in the 80s. The rise of 90s grunge rock proved to be the final nail in the hair metal genre's coffin, and Chad's dad was forced to go out and get a real job. After his father was sentenced to a 15-year prison sentence for trafficking in illegal narcotics, Chad's mom took him and his siblings to live with Grandpa Dan back in Vermont. Being their only father figure, Grandpa Dan was a big influence on how Chad's brother and sister viewed the world. By the time his mother remarried again, Chad's brother had already joined the military and his sister was in college and dating a Navy officer cadet. Chad moved out with his mother and her new husband, living in the basement of their house ever since. It was a summer after he dropped out of college for the second time, and Chad only knew one thing. He definitely didn't want to go back to school. He was laying on the couch in his mum's basement playing God of War on the new Xbox that his mum had got for his birthday, racking his brain to find a way to explain to her that he wouldn't be going back to college when it started up again in 2 weeks. He was sure that his mum would be cool with it, understanding that her youngest son was still trying to find himself, still trying to discover an identity which he was comfortable with. Well, to be honest, Malcolm Van King wasn't even Chad's real last name. It was Lincoln. Chad changed his last name after his college American political science professor, Mr. Rosa Parks, informed Chad that he shared the last name of a Republican president, known only for owning slaves. His mom's husband, Jack, however, would probably not be as understanding, expecting Chad to go out and find a job to help pay the bills. This, of course, was a ridiculous thing to ask Chad to do, seeing as how the world's plagued with sicknesses, pandemics, climate change, and systemic racism. The fact that his mom's husband would even think about telling Chad to find a job in such a world was proof positive of Jack's sense of white privilege. Jack was lucky that he was the one who was paying the bills and putting the food on the table, or else Chad would have told his mum to leave his worthless ass. Chad was contemplating raiding Jack's liquor cabinet, wondering if he could yet again get away with draining half of Jack's bottle of Woodford Reserve bourbon and replacing it with water, when his cell phone suddenly rang. It was his friends Joe and Jill. They were planning one last getaway, a backpacking trip through the Oregon wilderness to find themselves before the final semester of college began. But Chad still had some of his inheritance money left, so he eagerly agreed to join his friends on their 10-day hiking trip. 2 days later, after Chad had talked his mom into talking Jack into loaning him an additional $3,000 to cover college moving expenses, Chad and his friends found themselves atop a tall, flat hill overlooking a forested valley in the middle of one of Oregon's state parks, roasting marshmallows and melting s'mores. They also found themselves in possession of some fine herb, and soon the unmistakably thick scent of marijuana blanketed their campsite. The sun was setting, and the golden rays bathed the entire valley in a gold-green glow as Chad, Joe, and Jill sat warming themselves around the fire pit. "Dude," said Joe, taking a hit of the third blunt of the evening. "You gotta check that place out. It's like... dude." "What are you talking about, man?" said a bleary-eyed Chad. "Is there gold there or not?" "Yeah, man," insisted Joe. "Absolutely sure of it. I mean, the locals talked about streams filled with gold nuggets all the time." "Yeah, dude, but hey, did you see any of it?" asked Chad. "Well, that's the thing, man," answered Joe. "Dude, the locals were so adamant that I'd go up there. It was, totally freaked me out, but I'm absolutely convinced that streams filled with gold nuggets are up there, man." Well, the conversation on this subject started when Chad explained his desire not to return to college, his desire not to go to work, and his desire to fight climate change, coronavirus, racism, bigotry, hatred, and right-wing extremism by staying home and playing video games. Chad also explained how his unfair, right-wing fanatical stepdad would probably insist that Chad get a job to help pay the bills in the house. But Chad needed money, and he needed it fast. More importantly, he needed to be wealthy without actually doing any type of strenuous work that might be a threat to his democracy. "The Philippines," said Chad. "What were you doing in the Philippines?" "Man," said Joe as he accepted the blunt back from Jill. "I went there to check out the scenery, relax on the beaches, sniff some young children's hair, get me some of that fine Filipino tail." "What?" screamed Jill, slapping Joe on his shoulder. "Is that why you said I couldn't come?" She grabbed the blunt from Joe just as he was passing it back to Chad. "Hang on," interrupted Chad. "You're saying that there are streams of gold in the Philippines. You're not shitting me." "Oh," replied Joe, grabbing the blunt back from Jill and inhaling deeply. "I'm absolutely convinced of it. Them folks where I stayed in Palawan, they talked about it like it was nothing. They just weren't interested in going up into the mountains and taking it. Something about some ancient mountain god or some shit. That scared them." "More religious bullshit standing in the way of ignorant people benefiting from progress," said Chad. Fuck them. If they ain't gonna take the gold, I will." "Okay, bro," said Joe blearily, passing the blunt back to Jill. "Hey, dude, give me a notebook. I'll draw a map of the place. It's called Mount Dumakulem." "Mount what?" said Chad, handing over the notebook and a pen to Joe. "Well, it's like Mount Dracula, only with a doom. Mount Doom Dracula," laughed Joe as he began scribbling in the notebook. For some reason, Chad found this funny and started laughing as well, while Jill, who didn't really get the joke, laughed along anyway because that's what you're supposed to do when you're fully baked. Later that night, after Joe and Jill had retired to their tent, Chad lay awake in his sleeping bag under his tent. A light rain was falling, and the relaxing pitter-patting on his tent conspired to lull his marijuana and tequila-addled mind to sleep. He could hear Joe and Jill having wasted, drunken, clumsy sex in their tent, but it was hardly a distraction to Chad. Well, he had much to think about. Chad still had $5,000 in the bank from his inheritance. That was it. That was all he had. All his friends had plans for the future after college, plans which involved them getting into politics, getting rich, and fucking up the country while doing it. But Chad, on the other hand, had nothing. No goals, no dreams, nothing outside of blaming global warming, the COVID pandemic, and racism for his lack of motivation to do anything useful with his life. But if Joe was right, if there was undiscovered nuggets of gold just waiting in those unexplored streams in the mountains of the Philippines, he'd have to find it. And he'd have made it. With his remaining $5,000, he could either go back to Vermont and spend the next few years inventing excuses as to why he doesn't feel like looking for a job, or he could take the chance and spend the last of his inheritance money in the Philippines searching for the elusive streams filled with gold. Well, at the very least, thought Chad, I'm going to get me some of that fine Filipino. He fell fast asleep before he could even finish his thought. Part 2. Can you speak English? Chad was waving his arms and hands in an exaggerated motion as he yelled at his Filipino driver outside of Manila International Airport. Do you know how to get to... Chad pulled out the map which Joe had drawn for him back in Oregon. Can you drive? And at this, Chad rocked his fist back and forth in the front of his chest in a driving motion. Drive me to Palawan. I want to see Mount Dracula. Dude, said his driver, a lean young man with a close-cropped military-style haircut after he'd opened the passenger door to his van. He wore a Steph Curry basketball jersey, tan cargo pants, and a pair of red and white Pumas. Dude, you've been hearing Filipinos speaking English since your plane landed. Just talk normally. I mean, what the fuck is your problem? Chad stared dumbfounded at his Filipino driver, amazed at how the Filipino native language of Tagalog sounded so much like English. Can you take me to Palawan? Chad shoved the hand-drawn map into the driver's face. He took it and stared for a moment. Jeez, buddy, can a fucking infant draw this? Said the driver. Look, pal, you can't drive to Palawan, since Palawan is an island. You'll have to go to Angeles City and catch a flight from Clark. It used to be a large U.S. Air Force base back in the day. Well, it's a 1-hour flight to Palawan. I can drive you to Clark Airfield if you like. It's about 4 hours counting traffic, but you'll have a nice view of the country that you're visiting. Hey, first time to the Philippines? What? Said Chad. What are you saying? I said, replied the driver, me driver you to Clark Air Base. Then you take airplane, vroom vroom, to Palawan. Okay, replied Chad as he placed his luggage in the back of the van. He felt a tremendous sense of accomplishment at being able to teach his ignorant Filipino driver how to communicate fluently in English. It took almost 2 hours to get out of the city due to the chaotic traffic. The heat and humidity in the air was making Chad sweat out all the liquor he consumed during the flight from Oregon to the capital city of the Philippines. Fortunately, the AC was working overtime, and he leaned back, letting the cool rush of air dry the sweat on his forehead. Eventually, Chad realized that most Filipino people actually spoke fluent English, although with a rather sing-song accent. And Chad became rather annoyed at his driver, whose name turned out to be Juan, for not mentioning this earlier. As they drove through Manila, Juan regaled Chad by pointing out the landmarks, the parks, malls, restaurants, hotels, and various other attractions which, Chad had to admit, were pretty impressive. The capital seemed to be equal parts upper-class metropolitan city, with shopping malls, resorts, and hotels much larger and fancier than any he'd seen back in the States, and urban concrete jungles of shanty towns. In truth, Chad wasn't very impressed with how Filipino males of his age group looked, but the women, well, they were every bit as lovely as Joe had promised. After leaving Manila, the road opened up into a major highway which ran in a straight line almost due north through green farmland and quaint towns and villages where the people seemed to be in a hurry to do nothing except enjoy the day. Along the way, they stopped for lunch at a McDonald's, Chad ordering a Big Mac meal with large fries and a Frosty. Well, Chad was actually impressed that the ice cream machines in Filipino McDonald's worked, while Juan ordered a fried chicken meal with a side of spaghetti and a pasta sauce with hot dog slices. Hey sir, wake up, we're here. Chad opened his eyes to Juan shaking him. He looked around to see that he was in another huge city, although the streets seemed to be much wider and the city blocks more organized and less chaotic, though no less busy than Manila. Welcome to Angeles City, sir, said Juan. Yeah, where's the airport? Asked Chad, wiping the drool from his lips as he looked around. It's not far from here, answered Juan, but I'd suggest that you take your rest. You still have jet lag, and you'll need some rest before going to Palawan, believe me. Take a nice hotel for the night, enjoy the nightlife, then leave bright and early in the morning. Chad looked around, then checked his wallet. He still had most of his cash left, and a night out partying where he could play the big, rich, white fish in a small pond overflowing with lovely tan ladies was appealing to him. But still, he did need to get some shut-eye. Juan took Chad to a reasonably priced hotel on a wide, long avenue, appropriately named Walking Street, which was lined with countless bars, gentlemen's clubs, restaurants, shopping plazas, and much, much more. The hotel where he was staying had a bar and restaurant, swimming pool, hot tub, and an outdoor deck. A flat-screen television and a plush queen-size bed awaited him, and, thankfully, an air conditioner which blew Arctic cold air. Chad dropped his bags and collapsed on the bed, wondering if it really was true that this was costing him only $35 a night. Damn, this was the best decision he'd made ever in his life. Chad woke up the next afternoon when Juan called him on his phone. His head was pounding and his mouth tasted like vinegar-soaked sandpaper. Well, he didn't remember much, only that last night was the best night of his life. Early in the evening, he vaguely remembered meeting with some guys serving in the New Zealand Army who'd come to Angeles City to relax and unwind. They commenced to do the most epic bar crawl in Chad's life and visited just about every club on that lively and vibrant avenue. The lovely women were almost as easy to order as the inexpensive liquor, and they flowed almost as freely. Chad didn't remember when he'd parted ways with the New Zealanders, but he did have some fond memories of 2 girls in his room, some weed and God, his wallet. Most of his money was gone, save for about $500. "Well, good afternoon, sir," said Juan. "Been trying to call you all morning. You missed your flight to Palawan." Chad was laying back in his bed, not believing how he let those thieving little women take advantage of him. "Look, I'm going to stick around here for one more day. Pick me up tomorrow, will you?" "I warned you to take it easy with the bar crawl, man," said Juan. "Hey, check your wallet. Make sure you're still good on the cash." Yeah, mumbled Chad before hanging up. This was the worst decision he'd ever made in his life. Well, just as Chad had expected, that cheapskate Jack wouldn't float him $5,000, even though the son of his wife was stranded in a hostile foreign country, practically a prisoner of war. Jack was unaware that Chad wasn't even in the States, Jack thinking that he'd loaned Chad the $3,000 in order to help him go back to college. Screw him, Chad thought. Yeah, he'll regret being so selfish after Chad made a fortune in gold. He told his mom how he was mugged by a gang of Filipino thugs yelling, "Make Philippines great again," and asked if she could loan him $5,000. Well, she apologetically said that she couldn't, because Jack had forbidden it. Enraged, Chad chastised his mum for allowing Jack to take advantage of her before angrily hanging up. Chad congratulated himself for resisting the temptation to go out and party that evening, and after an anxious night, Chad met Juan bright and early the following morning. By early afternoon, Chad was on a small island hopper flying over dozens of emerald islands, floating blissfully on sapphire blue seas. The small 19-seat passenger plane with all 24 passengers and 3 flight crew landed safely on the small airport in Palawan, looking like it was built by the castaways of Gilligan's Island. At the foot of the runway on the right was an expansive rice paddy, on the center of which rested the ruins of a crashed island hopper aircraft, very similar to the one in which Chad was riding. It had been turned into a chicken coop and pen for goats and pigs. The modest airport, which looked more like a Greyhound bus terminal, was located on a flat green plain, surrounded by rolling hills and farmland. It was pleasant enough, but the bustling seaside resort which Juan had been promised was nowhere to be seen. Chad immediately cursed Juan, that little jerk having purposely stranded him 1,000 miles from nowhere. The crowds of tourists were making their way to a line of passenger buses, which would be taking them to their hotels down in the resort city. Chad again cursed Juan, this time because Juan didn't think ahead to advise Chad that he'd have to make reservations at a hotel. Apparently for these people, adulting was difficult. Chad made his way to the cafe, thinking to get a drink and to plan his next move. Well, maybe he could find someone to drive him out to Mount Dumakulem from here. "Excuse me, sir." "Look, I don't have any money to spare," said Chad, turning to face the annoying scam artist. A young Filipino man who bore a slight resemblance to Juan stood before him, holding a sign with the name Chad on it. He wore a blue button-down Hawaiian shirt, khaki cargo shorts, and a pair of Nike baseball shoes. A pair of aviator glasses were pushed up on his forehead. Mr. Malcolm Van King? My name is Ray. I'm Juan's cousin. Yeah, he called me to take you to your hotel down in Coron. Chad smiled. Juan had thought of everything. The two got into Ray's cherry-red Land Rover Defender and turned down the wide 2-lane road which led to the resort city of Coron. Ray followed the line of tour buses as he described the scenery and attractions at the resort city, which Chad would soon be enjoying. The road wound past nothing but green farmland and pastures, dotted by water buffalo and free-roaming chickens as the land rose higher in elevation. An hour into the drive, and still no beaches and tourists, and Chad again became suspicious that this was a ploy by those sneaky locals to rob him in some desolate area and dump his body. They entered a small town at the top of a hill, which was decorated for blocks and blocks with signs, banners, and balloons welcoming visitors to the resort of Coron City, the gem of the Pacific. As they crested the hill, the picturesque vista of a resort city nestled in the bay of crystal-clear blue seas spread out before him. Dozens of emerald islands dotted the bay, and even from this distance he could see waterfalls and a myriad of boats and sampans filled with sightseers, tourists, and swimmers. Many of the buildings were tall and narrow, with roofs of Spanish tile. The roads were somewhat narrow, with relatively few four-wheeled vehicles save for the tour buses and sport SUVs, while the majority of the traffic seeming to be scooters and motorbikes. And as they entered the city proper, everywhere Chad looked, he saw the air of festivity under the bright, cloudless skies. Ray dropped off Chad at the doorstep of the Overlook Hotel, a tall, narrow building near the top of a concentric row of streets which gradually wound down to the seashore, which offered a commanding view of the entire resort area. Ray handed Chad a piece of paper saying, "This is my number, sir. Just call me when you're ready, and I'll take you back to the airport. You enjoy your stay, okay?" Chad waved goodbye before entering the hotel. It was indeed narrow, with sturdy oak steps winding up 4 flights of stairs, each flight only having 3 rooms. Juan reserved a 4th-floor room for Chad to ensure that he had the most spectacular view of the city, and Chad was pleasantly surprised to find that on the roof was a bar, with picnic tables and a hot tub for the guests. Cost for each night? An exorbitant $40. After dropping off his things in his rustic but very comfortable hotel room, Chad changed into his favorite Lady Gaga t-shirt, grey cargo shorts, and a pair of Birkenstock men's sandals, strapped his empty backpack on his back, and stepped out from the narrow entrance of his hotel and out into the busy streets. The air was humid, much like Manila, but the temperature was much cooler, the refreshing breeze wafting the salty sea air across the small resort city. He walked down the narrow street, which opened up into a larger thoroughfare lined with small shops, restaurants, bars, places to rent motorbikes, jet skis, boat tours, and everything else that would cater to the needs of the big-spending tourists. His senses reeled with the sensory explosion happening all around him. The music, the crowds, the smells of delicious exotic foods, the clamor of motorbikes and jeepneys, and the rainbow of colors coming from the brightly painted signs advertising the names of the many, many, many hotels, clubs, and eating establishments that lined every level of the town as the streets cascaded down towards the crystal blue waters. Chad made his way to an inviting bar and grill named the Ocean Moon and took a seat outside on a large tropical deck made of bamboo, nestled snugly under a thatched roof which shaded it from the sun. An attractive Filipino waitress came quickly to take his order, and when she returned with an ice-cold San Miguel beer and a shot of whiskey, Chad said, "Hey, is there any place where I can find a few things? Like, a claw head hammer, a rope, and maybe a wide, flat metal plate or bowl?" "You have strange taste in souvenirs," said the waitress. "Oh, I'm not looking for souvenirs," answered Chad. "Yeah, I was just kidding," smiled the waitress. "I think I know why you're here and what you're looking for. You'll find what you need down the street nearest the beach. Turn left, walk about a mile until you reach the hardware store." Chad looked down the street where the waitress had pointed. It was a quarter-mile walk to the beach, and it was going to be a bit of a strain under these humid skies. God, do people walk everywhere? Oh, no wonder Chad never saw any obese people here. Chad thanked the waitress and finished his drinks. Before he got up to leave, the waitress stopped him and said, "Well, if by chance you find what you're looking for, don't get greedy. Take what's given to you and be thankful for what you have." Chad smiled. "Yeah, well, I'm looking for a lot." The waitress smiled politely, as if she'd heard that many times before. "Well, just don't get greedy and enjoy your stay here." It took Chad almost an hour to walk to the hardware store, Chad marveling at the blue seas, which were so clear that the myriad of boats seemed to be floating on air. He walked past schools, Catholic cathedrals, and seashore hotels so fancy that they gave the ritzy hotels in Miami Beach a run for their money for about half the price of the stay. There was also a slummy side of the city, with neighborhoods of tin and bamboo-sided shacks built on stilts over the water. The hardware store was just on the outskirts of this neighborhood, and just as the waitress had said, Chad found everything he needed. Chad filled his shopping cart with all the tools he thought he might need to go prospecting for gold, and pushed it up to the cash register where a middle-aged man was waiting for him. The man, who was wearing a Boston Celtics jersey and a pair of tan slacks, looked at Chad with a slight smile on his face, then examined the claw hammer, 2-foot-wide aluminum serving plate, 50 feet of climbing rope, lanterns, and other odds and ends in his cart. "Oh, you're not going to need that stuff, sir," said the proprietor of the hardware store. "Better to save your money and spend it on a nice dinner for you and your boyfriend." Chad gave the man a look. "Hey, I'm not a..." "Hey," said the man, holding up his hands. "I'm not judging anyone. I'm just saying that if you plan to go prospecting for gold, you won't need that stuff." "Hey, how did you know I was..." "My niece works at the Ocean Moon, sir," said the proprietor. "She called saying that you might be stopping by." Okay, said Chad, getting visibly irritated that these backwoods hicks were dictating to him how to live his life with their stupid religious nonsense. "Well, why don't I need this stuff?" "Because if you're in need, you don't have to find the gold. The gold will find you, but only if you're in need." "Oh, yeah," said Chad, placing the items on the checkout counter. "Well, I'm really in great need, so I'll be taking these." "Okay, suit yourself," said the proprietor as he totaled up the purchase. "I hope you and your boyfriend find what you're looking for." "Hey, I told you I'm not..." "Good luck," said the proprietor, smiling broadly and waving. Thought Chad, grabbing up his merchandise and walking towards the exit. "Oh, these people are crazy. Every one of these people is batshit crazy." Once outside, he took off his backpack and stuffed it with his purchases, all except for the things that wouldn't fit inside, like the pan. Instead, Chad strapped the pan across the outside of his pack and began the walk back to the main tourist area, his mind now wondering how he would find a guide to take him to Mount Dumakulem. Part 3. It was late afternoon by the time he made it back to the tourist area, and his stomach was rumbling. Chad knew that he had to watch his money, but he figured he could splurge on a good meal, seeing as how the prices were very reasonable. Chad slowly began to notice that there were a good number of Caucasians here in Coron, no doubt to enjoy the attractions and scenery of this beautiful tropical island. Deciding to step into another bar and grill, a very tropical-inspired place called the Pirate's Tavern, Chad set down his backpack before taking a seat at the bar made of bamboo. Next to him was a Caucasian man, talking and joking in Tagalog with 3 Filipino friends sitting next to him. Chad ordered a Long Island iced tea, a glass of iced water, and a platter of chicken and beef skewers. "Hey mate, how you doing?" The white guy sitting next to Chad reminded him of a young Patrick Swayze when he'd starred in the gangster surfer movie Point Break, only this Patrick Swayze sported a beard. "My name's Hendrik," he said in a cheerful Australian accent. He held out a fist, and Chad obliged him with a fist bump. "Chad," Well, Chad, said Hendrik, looking at the pan, rope, and hammer that Chad had hanging off his backpack. You new here? That stuff isn't exactly what you need to enjoy your stay. Hey, where's your mask and snorkel, your flippers and beach towels? Yeah, I'm not exactly here for that, said Chad. You serious, mate? Said Hendrik. Look, me and my mates here run a boat tour and diving service where you can swim down to see the wreckage of sunken World War II Japanese ships. The water's clear and the view's incredible. You should check it out. Thanks, really, said Chad, suddenly regretting coming into the place. I think I'll pass. Okay, suit yourself, friend. But if I may I ask why you've come to the most beautiful place in the Pacific just to ignore the most beautiful place in the Pacific? Well, I'm looking for a guide to take me to Mount Dumakulem, said Chad. What, Mount who? Asked Hendrik. One of his Filipino friends whispered something into Hendrik's ear, and Hendrik nodded in remembrance. Ah, yeah, that's right. Well, I've never heard it called that before. Hendrik turned to Chad and said, Hey, Chad, mate, I'm afraid there's no such thing as Mount Dumakulem. What? Chad was suddenly beside himself. What are you saying? That's true, mate, said Hendrik, holding up his hands. Sorry, but I've never heard of a Mount Dumakulem. Nah, Dumakulem is the name of a Filipino mountain god, not a mountain. That son of a bitch, seethed Chad. That frickin' pothead Joe made me spend my last dime on a wild goose chase to find a mythical mountain god. Chad grabbed his temples and exhaled loudly. Now what am I gonna do? Hang on now, said one of Hendrik's Filipino friends, a lean young man with a swimmer's body. There is a mountain range up north. The largest central mountain there doesn't have a name. That's where Dumakulem is said to live. Maybe that's what your friend Pothead Joe was talking about. Well, hope sprung into Chad's eyes. What? You know where it's at? Dude, can you take me there? Sorry, man, said the Filipino. I'm afraid that I can't. I don't really have the need, so it'd be a waste of time. Yeah, but there's gold up there, right? Said Chad. There's gold, isn't there? Yes and no, the Filipino replied. What do you mean? Look, I'm tired of getting all the runaround with you people and your religious beliefs. Hey, take it easy, Chad, said Hendrik. Look, as the legend goes, if you have a need, the gold will be there for you. If not, if you're just there to get rich, well, you won't find anything. That's all my friend's trying to say. Now, if someone is in great need, they may be desperate enough to head out into those mountains, and more often as not, they return with exactly the amount of gold needed to pay for whatever emergency they need to pay for. But on the very rare occasion that someone goes up there for selfish reasons, they always come back empty-handed, or sometimes not at all, mate. Well, I'm definitely in need, pleaded Chad. Down to my last few $100s, and I have nowhere to get home. Well, you can come work with us, mate, said Hendrik. I can teach you a few skills, show you how to operate the boats, be an underwater guide out on the shipwrecks. And generally take care of the customers. Hey, look, the harder you work, the better the pay and tips. You'll make the money you need in no time. Who knows, you might even decide to stick around this tropical paradise. Well, Chad looked at Hendrik as if he'd just grown an extra head. What? No, what are you talking about? I mean, I've got to get back to college. I need that gold, and I need it now. Hendrik shrugged. Okay, mate, we'll have it your way. Look, meet me tomorrow morning at my dive shop. I'll take you up to where the mountain starts. Then, turning to his employees, Hendrik said, Hey, you guys mind minding the shop till I get back? Easy, boss. Okay, mate, said Hendrik, getting up to leave. Me and the boys here have to get back to work. See you at 8 tomorrow morning. Here, let me pick up the tab for you. Although Chad was grateful for the favor, he was still deeply disturbed that these local people allowed their belief in stupid mythologies to stand in the way of mining riches in gold. Worse, Chad was deeply disappointed that some otherwise decent fellow had allowed himself to be contaminated with their backwards Asian superstitions. That was yet another reason not to work here. Chad would be uncomfortable working someplace that would obviously be a hostile working environment. Ah well, thought Chad as he entered his hotel room, happy to feel the AC washing over him. It's not my fault they don't take advantage of science and reason. Chad repacked his backpack, taking what equipment he thought he'd need, including his tent and sleeping bag, as well as a change of clothes, canned goods, several bottles of water, a bottle of rum, and something else special to celebrate after he became filthy rich. Everything else he'd leave behind in his room until he got back. Satisfied that he'd packed enough for a few days, Chad showered, took a nap, then went out again in the evening to blow the last of his money on liquor and fine Filipino tale. Despite his bender out in town, Chad was able to get up on time the next morning, a little dehydrated and surprised to see that he still had $100 left in his wallet. He met Hendrik at his dive shop, surprised to see that the friendly Australian was waiting for him with a powerful Suzuki sport bike. "Well, good morning, Sleeping Beauty," smiled Hendrik, handing over a bag of freshly made donuts to Chad. "You still ready to head up to your Mount Dumakulem?" Yeah," said Chad as he sidled clumsily onto the rear of the bike, heavy rucksack on his back and bag of donuts in hand. Wrapping his arms around Hendrik, he said, I've never ridden on a motorcycle before." "No worries, mate," said Hendrik. "It's as easy as falling off a bike. Just hang on, you'll be fine." "Wait," said Chad. "Do you have helmets?" Hendrik laughed as he gunned the engine down the near empty streets. "Where do you think you're at, mate? California?" They soon came to the end of a paved road, Hendrik turning north up gravel roads bounded on both sides by scrub and low bushes. Up twists and turns, around low foothills they went, the gravel roads turning into hard-packed dirt trails with tall trees growing on either side. Chad saw none of these things as he held his eyes tightly shut, his head buried in Hendrik's back. After what seemed like hours, well, it had only been 30 minutes, Chad opened his eyes, surprised to still be alive, to Hendrik announcing, "Right, here we are." They were at the end of a wide dirt trail facing a gently rising plateau upon which a quaint and well-maintained village sat. It was near 9 o'clock and the smells of breakfast cooking intermingled with the sounds of roosters crowing, filling the air. As Chad's ears stopped ringing from the sound of the motorcycle, a young Filipino approached, a welcoming smile on his face. "Hello, Mr. Malcolm Van King. Can I call you Chad? I'm Brandon." The young Filipino male with wavy brown hair, wearing a Billabong surf t-shirt, shook Chad's hand. "Well, I'll be taking you up to the foot of the mountain." Chad rolled his eyes. "So you a cousin of Juan also?" "Who?" said Brandon. "Nah, mate," said Hendrik. "I called ahead to have Brandon meet us here. He's my best dive instructor." He fist-bumped, then gave Brandon a bro hug. "Hey, man. When are you and Giselle coming down with us to do some diving?" "Can't this weekend, bro," replied Brandon. "Semi-finals for the surf championship off the north coast this weekend. I'm going to use the prize money to help my little sister go to nursing school." "Right, mate," said Hendrik, turning to Chad. "Okay, mate. I'll leave you to Brandon's good hands here. Be back in 2 days to pick you up and bring you back down to the resort." "Well, sounds good," Chad replied. Wishing Brandon good luck in the coming surf championships, Hendrik hopped on the starter and turned around the gravel trail, roaring back down the hill. "Okay," said Brandon. "Would you like to rest up and maybe grab some breakfast before we head out?" "Oh, no thanks," said Chad, holding up a bag of crushed donuts. "I'd just as soon get started if that's okay with you." "That's fine, man," answered Brandon. "The trail up to the mountain stream is about a mile away. Can I help carry some of your gear?" Brandon said as they began their trek up a dirt walking trail that disappeared up into the trees. "Well, yeah, thanks," said Chad, removing his backpack and handing it over to Brandon. Brandon looked at Chad for a second, but said nothing as he shouldered his pack. Noticing the wide, flat aluminum plate that was strapped to the outside of the pack, Brandon asked, "What's the plate for, man? You plan to catch and eat some fish? Hey, you need to borrow a fishing pole? I have plenty." "No, dude," said Chad. I'm going up there to pan for some gold." "Oh, I see," said Brandon. "You're a gold prospector." "Yeah, I guess you could say that." "Do you get many gold prospectors up this way?" "No, not really," answered Brandon. Well, Chad's heart suddenly dropped. "So that means there isn't any gold up there?" "Oh, no," replied Brandon. "There's definitely gold up there. Enough for people in dire straits. Oh, you won't need that pan, though, or anything else to find gold. If you need gold, you don't have to look for it." Yeah, said Chad. "The gold will find you. I heard that back down in town." They walked for about another hour, the heavy burden of Chad's pack hardly slowing down Brandon as he talked about the trees and fauna and which fruits and berries were safe to eat and which to avoid. Well, Chad was barely paying attention as he was having a difficult time keeping up with his guide. Eventually, they came to the banks of a shallow, gently moving stream about 100 feet wide where the water was like glass, giving an almost window-like view to the smooth stones below. The water was refreshingly cold, and Chad wasted no time in splashing the water onto his sweating brow. Now somewhat refreshed and invigorated again, Chad looked up to see the long, winding stream flowing down between two high rocky ridges. "Well, Chad," said Brandon, removing Chad's pack, "this is it. This is the stream that you were looking for." "And there's gold here, right?" asked Chad expectantly. "Yeah, man, there's gold here. For those in need of it." He looked down at Chad's pack and the equipment that he brought. "Hey, you sure you're going to be okay?" Chad smiled, visions of himself coming down from this mountain with a backpack stuffed with gold nuggets filling his thoughts. "Oh, yeah, man, I'll be fine." "Okay," said Brandon skeptically. "Look, the water is clean and safe to drink, so stay near the stream. Also, take down my number. You can call me in case of emergency, okay?" "Yeah, sure, thanks," said Chad, as he impatiently waited for Brandon to program his number into his cell phone. When Brandon turned back down the trail, Chad couldn't believe it. He was alone, with a stream filled with gold nuggets, and it was all his. Unstrapping his pan, he started out panning for gold in the area that he was in. He observed several large freshwater fish swimming lazily in the water that he couldn't identify, but thought he could catch easily if he had a net or a pole. Thinking that he only had a bag of donuts and a few cans of vegetables and beans to sustain him, he tried to forgive Brandon for not trying harder to convince him into borrowing one of his fishing poles. After panning in that spot for about an hour, he decided to abandon the site and traveled further upstream. The sun was crawling high into the sky by then, but fortunately for Chad, who had neglected to purchase any sunscreen or a wide-brimmed hat, the steep and high mountainside sheltered Chad from most of the sun's rays as he continued to pan for those elusive gold nuggets. Part 4. The hours passed, and the further he moved upstream, the more frustrated he was becoming. Aside from the constant buzzing of biting insects, Chad had also forgotten to buy insect repellent and didn't pay attention when Brandon showed him which plant to burn which would create a smoke to ward off biting insects. Chad was having absolutely no luck finding any gold. Once again, Chad began blaming Joe, Juan, Brandon, Hendrik, the New Zealand Army, his mother's husband Jack, and Almighty God who doesn't exist. Well, everybody else he could think of who conspired to put him in this mess. It was late afternoon when he finally dragged himself from the stream, shivering despite the heat. He hunched on a flat stone which jutted out from the side of the cliff, munching on stale donuts and a can of tropical fruit in syrup, and cursing the stream which quietly rippled by. Packing his gear, he moved further upstream to a point on the hill where his side of his bank had petered down to a relatively flat plateau again. On the opposite bank, however, the sheer rocky cliff remained. The sun now shone brightly down in this area as Chad began panning the stream for his elusive treasure trove of gold nuggets. As the afternoon passed, and with Chad finding absolutely nothing of value for his efforts, the sky suddenly darkened rapidly and, in the distance, he heard the peal of thunder. "Oh, shit," yelled Chad at the top of his lungs. His expletive echoed across the ravine. It was going to rain, and with it, Chad knew that the stream would soon become a rushing tide, making it dangerous to continue panning. Cursing the climate change which caused inconvenient things like rain, Chad again waded out of the stream and gathered his things, moving back well away from the stream and setting up camp at a slightly elevated part of rocky ground. He got his tent set up, and sleeping bag rolled out just as the first drizzle of rain began to fall. There wasn't enough dead fall to create a fire, so Chad simply crawled into his tent, damp and sweaty, and lay atop his sleeping bag. The biting insects were buzzing inside his tent, landing and drawing blood from him, but Chad was too distracted to care. For the first time in his life, Chad had no safety nets. He had no one to blame. He had no parents, no family, no friends, no politicians trying to buy his vote, no one to rescue him by giving him other people's money. He was out in the world by himself, having to rely upon the awesome, beautiful, magnificent, amazing, empowered and wonderful things the world said he had plenty of. Chad was afraid, finally realizing that none of those platitudes mattered when you were outside in the rain and your wonderful, magnificent, beautiful, and empowered ass had absolutely no freaking idea what you were doing. Fortunately, Chad had a bottle of spiced rum that he'd purchased back in Coron, plus the weed left over from Angeles City. He decided to imbibe in healthy quantities of both, and soon, Chad was feeling no pain at all. He was lying on his sleeping bag, staring up at his leaking tent as the skies grew darker, and the rain tapped a sleepy reveille on his roof. He felt like crying. Yes, the Houston Astros had been caught cheating in the last World Series, and yes, they happened to be in the World Series again this year. But they did it because of the hard work and dedication. Well, they changed. God, it was so unfair that people were trying to condemn the Houston Astros for mistakes they'd made in the past. Well, if the Astros only had Barney the dinosaur as their mascot. Barney was a trusted and truthful reptile who enjoyed ice cream and sniffing the hair of little girls. Well, he was practically president. Barney the purple dinosaur could convince America to give the Houston Astros a break. Chad was too far gone to notice that, even as the rain dropped on his tent, all around him was complete silence. Even the sound of buzzing insects was silent. The ground beneath him heaved and settled, and the low, slow, rhythmic bellow of air could be heard and felt, much like a giant taking deep, slow breaths. Chad noticed none of this as he cried mournfully to absolutely nobody. God, how freaking dare anyone make fun of the Astros after all they've been through? And the Astros are human beings. Leave the Houston Astros alone. Chad wasn't particularly a big Astros fan, nor a fan of baseball in general. But Chad's tears fell anyway at how unfair the world treated people who were just trying to do their best to get ahead, even if it meant cheating. He passed out, completely oblivious that the stakes which held his tent up had collapsed, the soaking tent falling upon his drenched sleeping bag as the ground upon which he lay was heaving up and down. The world was young and pristine, fresh, clean, sparkling and beautiful. The Creator, he whose blessings had created these emerald islands and shining seas, looked upon his creation, and he was well pleased. The Creator charged his faithful servant Dumakulem to ward over his creation, safeguarding and protecting the land, sea, air, and those living things which existed upon them. Dumakulem the gentle, Dumakulem the patient, Dumakulem the just, was more than happy to fulfill the will of the Creator, for this place was beautiful beyond measure. This place was blessed. "What is your need?" a gentle voice echoed in Chad's unconscious mind. "What is your need? What is your need?" Chad stirred as the image of a giant made of stone, hundreds of feet tall, looked down on him. "What's my need? What's my need? I need everything given to me." "God, who the hell are you to stand in judgment of me?" yelled Chad at the stone giant staring down at him with its glowing yellow eyes. The clouded sky above was clear, bright, and blue as seabirds glided lazily by. The sun washed upon the shore, singing a calming lullaby as the waves retreated back from whence it came, only to rush ashore once more. Meanwhile, violent lightning spewed from Chad's mouth, rumbling the ground and felling the trees. "You know my history. You don't know how much I've struggled. Can I deserve everything? Everything, you hear? Everything. Bitch, what you need is a come-to-Jesus moment," said the stone giant as he raised his feet and sent it slamming down on Chad. Chad awoke suddenly to a thunderous boom and the rumbling of an earthquake. He was underwater and drowning, but he couldn't get out. Something had wrapped itself around him, keeping him underwater. Panicked, he screamed and gagged, fighting for air as he pushed back against whatever was holding him captive. Eventually he managed to fight his way out of his sleeping bag and pull himself out from under the tent which had collapsed on him. It was mid-morning, and the warming rays of the sun had already burned away the morning mists and dew from last night's rainfall. Still, Chad was completely wet from the rains and sweat. He was bedraggled and thirsty. As he stumbled towards the stream, Chad noticed that the ground upon which he had set his tent was upturned, as if someone took a giant hoe and ploughed the hard-packed rocky ground during the night. Was it like that when he'd set up camp? Chad couldn't remember. God, his throat was parched, as if he'd been yelling, though he couldn't remember what he'd been yelling about. Stumbling into the cool stream, Chad cupped his hands and splashed some of the fresh water on his face and hair, before cupping his hands again and pouring some water into his mouth. Refreshed, he was about to dip his hands into the water when something shining caught his eyes. Reaching down into the stream bed of smooth stones, Chad snatched up the glinting objects. The two nuggets were smooth, as if polished, and teardrop-shaped. "Gold!" screamed Chad's brain. It was pure gold, and by the weight of the teardrop-shaped nuggets, they totaled about 2 ounces. Chad did some quick calculations and concluded that these 2 nuggets must be worth about $5,000. Well, there was more. There had to be more. Rushing back to his fallen campsite, Chad grabbed up his plate and frantically began panning the stream for more of the curiously shaped nuggets of gold. Rushing back to his fallen campsite, Chad grabbed up his plate and frantically began panning the stream for more of the curiously shaped nuggets of gold. Hours passed, unnoticed by Chad, who also failed to notice the lack of sound around him. No birds, no insects, no sound of the waters rippling. Even the fish in the stream seemed to stop moving, as if observing and judging Chad as he scooped up the rocks into his plate and alternately chucked them back into the stream. It was mid-afternoon when Chad finally splashed back to shore. He was nearly a mile away from his campsite, and he'd failed to find even a glimmer of more gold nuggets. He sat on a flat stone boulder, letting the sun dry his sunburned back. There was no way he was going back with just $5,000 in gold nuggets. Hell, that was the amount he'd had when he left the States. It just wasn't fair. Why was the world so The sun's rays reflected off of something in the cliff face on the opposite bank. Chad had to shield his eyes to look at it. Emerald vines hung down from the cliff top, beneath which was a shallow fissure in the cliff wall. The fissure was about 50 feet long and which bowed towards the middle like a smiley face. The crack in the cliff was peculiar, as it seemed to have been machined into the rocks, as if it had been purposefully carved there like someone might swipe a finger into the icing of a cake. These peculiarities went unnoticed to Chad, as what was reflected within the curious fissure was what excited him. Gold. The entire fissure was lined with gold. The curved shape of the fissure made Chad feel as if the whole world was smiling down on him as he looked for a way to climb up to the treasure. He'd left his rope behind at the campsite, but it'd be useless anyway, seeing as he'd not brought any anchors to hook into the rock. All he had was his claw hammer attached to a loop in his cargo shorts, and his pan. The fissure was about 50 feet up the cliff face. To the left of it and below was a triangular outcropping which jutted into the stream and ended just to the left of the fissure. Chad figured that if he could lift himself up the rock outcropping and then carefully shimmy his way up to the 50-foot ramp, he could hopefully reach over and grab the vines hanging down from the top of the cliff. If he could somehow balance his feet on a narrow ledge or brace his body against the stone cliff face while grabbing the vines with one hand, With the other, he could use his hammer to chip away and pry away the chunks of gold. He had no gloves or knee or elbow pads as he attempted to hoist himself up on the rock outcropping. By the time he was at the base of it, his hands were already bleeding. The climb up the sloping outcropping was precarious as rocks tumbled and fell the more he tried to gain footing. Minutes later, however, bruised and bleeding from scrapes on his elbows and knees, Chad was clinging to the narrow point at the top of the outcropping. Above him was the long line of hanging vines which carefully he reached for. The vines were moist and slippery, but Chad held on tightly, pulling them to see if they'd support his weight. And to his surprise, they did. Carefully, oh, so carefully, Chad pulled himself to the left, tentatively easing himself off the outcropping. Feet waving around the cliff, looking for a ledge to find footing. It was a slow and harrowing process, and Chad was sweating and breathing heavily. He dared not look down at the rocks which awaited him if he slipped. He was 4 feet away from the outcropping now, still clinging onto the vines and precariously balanced on narrow rocks which jutted slightly out of the cliff. The fissure was just inches away from his face, 4 inches high and 50 feet long and filled with gold. This was it. Chad's gamble had paid off. He couldn't believe his good luck. Slowly, with his free hand, he reached for the hammer in the loop of his cargo shorts, and was suddenly yanked straight up into the air. A great golden orb seemed to stare impassively at the terrified young man hanging there desperately clinging to his long emerald-green vines. In an instant of clarity, Chad realized with a start that the fissure was just a monstrous closed eyelid. The vines were the eyelashes, and the outcropping which he climbed up was the nose of some horribly massive stone face, half buried within the mountain. Or perhaps the face was the mountain. In any event, Chad knew one thing as he stared at the 50-foot eye made of pure gold. "I'm rich," yelled Chad in both horror and excitement, if such a thing were even possible. "I'm frickin' Donald Trump rich. I'm rich, bitch." With his free hand, Chad reached into his cargo pocket and grabbed the claw hammer that he'd bought back at the resort town. Then, using the vines he was clinging to as a Tarzan swing, he swung towards the giant golden eye, arm cocked back as he prepared to deliver a mighty blow with his hammer. And then, the eye blinked, and Chad lost his grip. He fell, still trying to swing his hammer wildly at the golden orb which was just within his reach then, before he slammed abruptly into the rocks 50 feet below. The gently moving stream gradually turned into a roaring flood of raging white water, which washed Chad's broken body down and away from the mountain, down a narrow draw into the lush green foothills, which ended in a spectacularly beautiful waterfall, which dumped poor Chad's body into the crystal blue waters of the South China Sea. Small golden teardrops fell from Dumakulem's great golden eye, which dropped into the now gently flowing stream. Then the benevolent and generous mountain god closed his eye again and slept. Chad awoke to bright light shining down on him. When his blurry eyesight cleared, he saw that he was in a hospital bed, a middle-aged Filipino nurse taking his vital signs. 2 familiar-looking faces also stared down at him. "Hendrik? Brandon? Where? You're in the hospital, man," said Hendrik. "You've got to be the luckiest Yank that ever lived, mate." Hendrik's voice was filled with awe. "How?" "Brandon here was competing in the semi-finals of the surfing championship up on the north coast." "Yeah, man," said Brandon. "I was executing a killer 360 when I accidentally smashed into your floating body. The doctor said that's how you broke your arm." Chad held up his right arm, realizing for the first time that it was in a cast. "Yeah, sorry, dude," Brandon apologized. "So you brought me back to shore?" Chad's voice was weak. Brandon just shrugged his shoulders. "It cost him a chance to advance to the finals," said Hendrik. "There's always next year, boss," said Brandon, before turning his attention back to Chad. "Anyway, did you find what you're looking for, man?" I don't..." Chad had no idea how to explain what he'd experienced. He wasn't even sure if what he'd experienced was real. His mind was walking a tightrope, trying not to fall into a pit of insanity. "Here, man," said Brandon, dropping 2 small objects into Chad's good hands. "You lost everything, but I found these in your pockets. Don't know how they didn't fall out." "Yeah, docs say that aside from your broken arm, you're a collection of nothing but bumps, bruises, and sprains," said Hendrik. "And you'll be laid out for a while before you can go surfing again." "Yes, and he won't be getting any rest with you two bothering him," scolded the nurse. "Out! Out! Time to get out!" Chad looked down at the palm of his hand, seeing 2 teardrop-shaped gold nuggets. He resolved to give them to Brandon, the man who'd saved his life at the cost of losing the prize money that he was going to give to his sister to go to school. "Hey, Hendrik, wait," Chad said. "Yeah, mate? What's up?" asked Hendrik as the nurse was shushing him and Brandon out of the door. "Hey, man," replied Chad. "Listen, when I get out of here, could I still get a job?" Well, I have to say I haven't done a Taxi Dancer story in quite a long time, and I've really missed his work. Excellent one there again, just as always. Well, I think the best way to finish off tonight's story is with a selection of author's notes. So, Dumakulem is a mythological Filipino god of the mountains, believed to be generous and benevolent, but very distasteful of greed and waste. Well, the interactions between the protagonist and locals that he meets are based on actual events related to the author by Filipinos serving in the tourist industry. Finally, the resort of Coron, Palawan, is an actual location that can be visited and is considered as one of the most scenic tourist destinations in the world. So there you go, bit of homework for you all. Next time you're in the Philippines, go check it out, if you dare. Well, that is me for this evening. Back again very soon. Hope you enjoyed that one, just as all the others. And yeah, until the next time, very, very sweet dreams and goodbye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or 2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.